let's go to the US now, where you saw the other day Donald Trump, of course, did an interview with Joe Rogan on his podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, which is one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And so the question has rightfully been asked, when is Kamala Harris going to do an appearance? And it has nothing to do with the fact that Joe Rogan doesn't want her there. He has invited her to appear on the podcast, but she and her team have set down some ground rules about how it would operate. Now, keep in mind that Donald Trump went to Rogan's studio in Texas. He was interviewed for 3 hours, which is generally how long Rogan's podcasts go for. Not good enough for Kamala Harris. She must maintain control. Rogan said, for the record, the Harris campaign has not passed on doing the podcast. They offered a date for Tuesday, but I would have had to travel to her, and they only wanted to do an hour. I strongly feel the best way to do it is in the studio in Austin. My sincere wish is to just have a nice conversation and get to know her as a human being. I really hope we can make it happen. He's tried to make it happen. He's made the offer and they've said no, it will only happen on her conditions. Well, why was it that Trump was unafraid to go to his studio, his territory, and sit down and talk for 3 hours, but Kamala Harris won't? I wonder why. Maybe because she couldn't fill in 3 hours of interview, particularly knowing the way that Joe Rogan conducts his interviews. He doesn't go in there and let anyone get away with anything. It's a very conversational style of interview, right? And even more so than a formal, sit-down, hard-hitting interview, I think that is a space in which she would really struggle, unless she's on friendly territory like that Call Her Daddy podcast that she did. Because when you're asked to genuinely be you, and you're trying to sell policies that you don't necessarily agree with, people see through it right away. She knows the danger that there would be in going and doing that podcast, because she couldn't sit there for 3 hours and talk, about all and sundry like Donald Trump could, because she doesn't have a clue about all and sundry.
And that's the problem. It's less of an interview and more of a conversation. And most politicians are really good with talking points. Well, Kamala Harris is a talking point machine. That's all she does. I was raised in a middle-class family, and a 3-hour conversation is going to expose her, because while Trump can explain himself, Kamala Harris is completely unable to explain herself. But the other interesting part about this, Liz, is that Kamala Harris really needs Joe Rogan right now.
Yeah.
But Joe Rogan does not need her at all. Joe Rogan's podcast will continue successfully well after November, but Kamala Harris may not, which is probably why politicians right around the world are so desperate to regulate online podcasts, blogs, social media, because they no longer control the narrative. And Joe Rogan says, well, you'll talk to me for 3 hours or you won't talk to me at all. And he's calling the shots. And Joe Rogan is like a school dropout who ended up commentating on UFC?
Now
he's dictating terms to the US vice president, Democrat candidate.
To be clear, Joe Rogan has the most listened to podcast in the world. He gets millions and millions of people tuning in every single week for the most fascinating conversations. Like Caleb said, most of them are 3 hours long. So it's a long-form conversation with some of the most famous people on the planet. And Kamala could have really done with this, but her team knows better. When you have someone like Trump and JD Vance, see, their campaign is very smart. Trump and JD Vance have gone on a podcast spree. This is not the first podcast Trump has done, certainly the most famous. JD Vance last week went on a podcast with Theo Von, who is the most hilarious comedian. He's very sacrilegious. And so most of the time they just spent it laughing their heads off. But the amount of people who watch that on the Theo Von podcast instead of JD Vance, I can't believe I was ever told by the mainstream media that this guy was a weirdo. He's hilarious. He's just sitting around with Theo Von talking for ages about releasing the Epstein client list and all these really interesting things. Kamala's team knows that she can't do this, because how many times have we seen her, even in short-form interviews on mainstream media like CNN, refer people to her website. When she is asked about her policy, she'll be like, oh, I've got over 80 pages on my website. I know, I'm referring you to a website, but that's what you got to do. No, it's not, because if you stand on principle and you have convictions about anything and you haven't changed half of your policies, if not more, in order to run for president, you know exactly what you're going to say about any given topic. That's how they've been shown up once again. Trump and JD Vance have been dancing through these podcasts, having a whale of a time. Millions of people, not just Americans, people around the world have watched these and gone, these guys are lads. I really like them. They can really hold their own. The Kamala campaign has done the only thing that they could do in this situation, which is decline by setting parameters that the new Rogan could never agree to.